Right now, tonight, the Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of the most dangerous escalation the Middle East has seen in months. And if you've only been half following the headlines, you need to understand just how fast this has moved. In the span of one single week, the United States has launched strikes against Iran on 4 separate consecutive nights. 4. And by the time you finish this breakdown, you're going to understand exactly why this matters. Not just for the region, but for what's sitting in your gas tank and what's coming down the pipeline for the global economy. If this is your first time here, go ahead and subscribe, because we're going to walk through exactly what's been confirmed, by name, by date, by source. Not vague speculation dressed up as insider knowledge. So let's set the timeline straight, because this didn't come out of nowhere. Back in June, the United States and Iran had signed an interim agreement, a memorandum of understanding, extending an earlier ceasefire that had ended the broader U.S.-Israel war on Iran, a war that had begun back in late February of this year. That memorandum, signed on June 17th, was built around a simple trade. The U.S. would lift its naval blockade on Iranian ports, and in exchange, Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz to normal shipping traffic. Washington also agreed at the end of June to waive sanctions on Iranian oil for 60 days. On paper, this looked like the off-ramp everyone had been hoping for. It didn't hold. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, the U.S. Treasury Department moved to revoke that sanctions waiver less than 20 days after the memorandum was signed, canceling a license that had allowed Iran to produce, sell, and deliver crude oil through August 21st. And then, on July 7th, the actual shooting resumed. CENTCOM said its strikes on Iran that day came in direct response to Iranian attacks on 3 commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. hit what officials described as more than 80 targets with precision munitions in around 4 hours, striking Iranian air defense systems, coastal surveillance networks, surface-to-air missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, and drone launch sites. Iran's response was immediate. Iranian military leadership pledged what they called a crushing response, and the IRGC claimed it shot down a US MQ-9 drone over southern Iran that same day. From there, this escalated fast night after night, and the pattern here is worth sitting with for a second, because it tells you something about where this is actually heading. On July 11th, following an attack on a Cyprus-flagged container ship in the Strait, U.S. forces hit roughly 140 Iranian military targets in a single night, one of the largest single rounds of this entire renewed conflict. Iran responded by declaring the strait closed to traffic and launching what it called retaliatory strikes on Prince Hassan Air Base in Jordan. Sirens sounded across Bahrain and Qatar. Kuwait's air defenses engaged what its military called hostile missile and drone attacks. This wasn't a 2-country exchange anymore. It was already pulling in half the Gulf. Then came July 12th, a second consecutive night of strikes, this time explicitly tied, according to a CENTCOM spokesperson, to Iran's Revolutionary Guard firing on yet another commercial vessel in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran hit back with what it described as strikes toward U.S. bases across the region. Jordan's military reported intercepting 4 missiles that had entered its airspace directly from Iranian territory. Oil markets reacted immediately. Brent crude climbed more than 3% that single day. By July 13th, the 3rd consecutive night, President Trump had formally notified Congress that what the administration called limited military action had resumed against Iran. In an interview with radio host Hugh Hewitt, the president was blunt about what was coming, saying the U.S. was going to hit Iran very hard that night and hard again the next day. When asked whether the U.S. or Israeli military knew the location of Iran's remaining military leadership, Trump responded that he didn't know, but declined to elaborate further, saying only that they were being watched closely. That same day, Iran said it struck and disabled 2 vessels it called rogue supertankers. Hours later, the UAE reported Iranian missiles had hit 2 of its own tankers inside Omani territorial waters, killing 1 crew member. Brent crude didn't just rise that day, it surged nearly 10% in a single session, settling at $83.30 a barrel, its biggest one-day percentage jump in over 6 years. And that brings us to right now, the 4th consecutive night of strikes, with the U.S. formally reimposing its naval blockade on Iranian ports, and President Trump publicly warning that bridges and power plants could be next if Tehran doesn't return to the negotiating table. 4 nights, 4 escalating rounds, a blockade back in effect, oil markets in genuine turmoil, and that's before we even get into exactly which Iranian cities have been hit, what's actually left of Iran's ability to strike back, and why the Strait of Hormuz itself has become the single most important pressure point in this entire conflict. That's exactly where I'm taking you next. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and whether you think this de-escalates or spirals further. I want to see how this community reads the situation before we go further. Let's talk about the map, because once you actually trace where these strikes have landed over the past week, a pattern emerges that tells you far more about strategy than any single explosion ever could. This isn't a scattered campaign hitting random targets across Iran. It's tightly concentrated along one specific stretch of coastline, and understanding why reveals exactly what both sides are actually fighting over. According to CENTCOM's own statements and geolocated reporting from CNN, the cities and sites hit over these 4 nights read like a checklist of everything tied to Iran's control over the Strait of Hormuz. Bushehr, home to Iran's main nuclear facility; Chabahar and Konarak in the southeast near the Pakistani border; Jask, Bandar Abbas, and Keshem Island, all sitting directly along or facing the strait itself; Abu Musa, a small island in the Persian Gulf; Sarik, a coastal town that Iranian state media specifically reported saw explosions during the July 7th strikes, along with a commercial pier there where several people were reported injured by shrapnel. A U.S. official told Reuters the targets specifically included coastal surveillance systems, drone and missile capabilities, and anti-ship cruise missiles, weapons whose entire purpose is threatening exactly the kind of shipping lane running through this water. Here's why that concentration matters. The Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most critical choke points for global energy supply on the planet. A massive share of the world's oil moves through this narrow passage every single day, and any disruption here doesn't stay local. It ripples into global markets within hours. That's not a talking point. That's exactly what happened this past week. Traffic through Hormuz dropped by roughly 52% week over week between July 10th and July 12th, according to shipping data from KPLR, with vessels reverting to what's being described as defensive routing patterns, leaning on Iranian and unofficial routes while avoiding the corridors authorized by the International Maritime Organization. War risk premiums for the strait are expected to keep climbing sharply, according to Lloyd's List Intelligence, as ship owners and charterers pause decisions on whether to transit the waterway at all. By July 14th, the U.S. had gone further than strikes alone. CENTCOM formally reimposed its naval blockade of vessels moving to and from Iranian ports and coastal areas, effective 8 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time that evening. Trump, speaking from the White House, framed this explicitly as the U.S. positioning itself as what he called the guardian of the Strait of Hormuz. He'd also floated, and then walked back, a plan to charge commercial shippers a 20% fee on cargo value moving through the strait to reimburse the U.S. for providing security there, later saying that fee would instead be replaced by Gulf state investment commitments into the U.S. Now, here's where the map genuinely starts to expand beyond a simple two-country fight. According to Al Jazeera's coverage, Iranian officials and state media reported that the July 14th round of strikes also hit Abadan, which hosts the oldest oil refinery in the entire Middle East, along with the port city of Mashhar and Kish Island. And it was at Mashhar, according to Iranian state outlet IRNA, that the human cost of this campaign became concrete. A projectile struck a water pumping station there, killing a security guard and wounding 4 others. That's the first confirmed fatality directly tied to this specific round of strikes. But it's Iran's response that's been reshaping the regional picture the fastest. This is no longer a bilateral exchange between Washington and Tehran. Sirens have sounded across Bahrain, home to the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet, on multiple nights this past week. Kuwait's military has repeatedly reported dealing with what it calls hostile aerial targets. Jordan's forces intercepted missiles entering directly from Iranian airspace. The UAE reported Iranian missiles struck 2 of its own tankers inside Omani waters. And on July 14th specifically, Kuwait's fire force said it extinguished a blaze it directly attributed to what it called hostile Iranian aerial aggression. CNN was able to geolocate that strike to an industrial park near the Mina Abdullah area, using satellite heat signature data from NASA's fire tracking systems. That's not rhetoric. That's a documented, geolocated strike on Kuwaiti soil. Elsewhere in the region, tensions that had nothing directly to do with this specific U.S.-Iran exchange have started reigniting in parallel. Saudi Arabia and Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi rebels among them, adding yet another volatile front to a situation that's already spreading well past its original 2 participants. There is, however, a meaningful and measurable gap between the scale of Iran's stated warnings and what's actually been landed night after night, and that gap matters enormously for understanding where this goes next. Alex Vatanka, a senior fellow with the Middle East Institute, offered a read on the American side of this calculation that's worth sitting with. He suggested Trump appears to be betting that enough sustained pressure eventually pushes Iran back toward genuine negotiations. But he was blunt in calling that a gamble, warning that this approach could just as easily produce further escalation, since Iran has consistently signaled throughout this war that it responds to pressure with retaliation rather than concession. That's not a prediction of doom. It's a straightforward description of a pattern that's held for months now, verified by exactly what we watched happen this past week. Pressure applied, retaliation delivered, pressure applied again. There's also a domestic dimension to this that shouldn't get lost. The strikes hitting power infrastructure, oil refineries, and water pumping stations aren't just military targets on a map. They're systems ordinary Iranian civilians depend on for daily life. When strikes disrupt electricity, water access, and fuel supply simultaneously, in a country already dealing with a leadership transition and months of accumulated economic strain, that creates friction between public frustration and a government's ability to maintain order. History with Iran's government suggests it has weathered internal unrest before. But the specific combination happening right now, a new and largely unseen supreme leader, sustained infrastructure strikes, and a naval blockade actively cutting into Iran's oil exports, represents a genuinely unusual convergence of internal and external pressure hitting all at once. And that pressure isn't staying contained inside Iran's borders either. It's already reaching directly into markets and pump prices well beyond the region. Drop your take in the comments. Do you think the current silence from Iran's leadership is a sign of caution or a sign that Iran's government is genuinely scrambling to find its footing during an active war? I want to see this community's read before the final section. Let's bring this all together, because once you connect the military picture to the economic one, you start to understand why this specific week matters so much more than just another round of headlines out of the Middle East. This is where the consequences of 4 consecutive nights of strikes stop being confined to Iran's coastline and start showing up in places that affect literally everyone reading a price at the pump. Start with oil, because the numbers here tell their own story with almost no need for commentary. Brent crude, the global benchmark, rose more than 3% on July 12th alone. By July 13th, it had surged nearly 10% in a single session, settling at 83.30 a barrel. Its highest close since mid-June, and its single biggest one-day percentage move in over 6 years. WTI, the U.S. benchmark, climbed roughly the same amount, settling around $78.14. That's not a market shrugging off a distant conflict. That's a market pricing in real, immediate fear about supply disruption through the one waterway that a significant share of the world's daily oil shipments depends on. And according to CNBC's reporting, citing Kepler shipping data, that fear is already changing behavior on the water itself, with crossings through Hormuz falling by roughly 52% week over week as vessels shift toward what's being called defensive routing, avoiding internationally authorized corridors altogether. Here's why that matters beyond the headline number. War risk premiums, the extra cost insurers charge to cover ships willing to transit a dangerous corridor, are expected to keep climbing sharply according to Lloyd's List intelligence, and ship owners and charterers are actively pausing decisions on whether to send vessels through the strait at all right now. Every day that uncertainty continues, it adds cost, delay, and risk to a global supply chain that doesn't have an easy alternative route for the volume this waterway normally carries. And this is happening at a moment when, according to Al Jazeera's own reporting, even the mere perception of instability near Hormuz is enough to move prices within hours. We're not talking about perception anymore. We're talking about 4 confirmed nights of strikes, a reinstated blockade, and a documented measurable collapse in normal shipping. Now layer the political calculation on top of that, because this is where the next few weeks genuinely hang in the balance. President Trump has been explicit about the strategy here, warning publicly that bridges and power plants could be next unless Tehran returns to the negotiating table, while simultaneously walking back his own proposed 20% toll on Hormuz shipping in favor of Gulf state investment commitments into the U.S. instead. That's a leader trying to apply maximum pressure while also signaling, even if only implicitly, that there's still a door open to negotiation. But as Alex Vatanka's assessment made clear, the strategy depends entirely on a bet that Iran eventually chooses negotiation over continued retaliation, and everything we've tracked across this breakdown says that bet is far from settled. Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister, Kazem Garibabadi, has already gone on record accusing the U.S. of destroying the interim memorandum entirely and declaring that Tehran now considers itself free of any commitments under that agreement. That's about as clear a statement as you're going to get, at least from Iran's side, that the diplomatic track which produced the June ceasefire is treated as dead. And historically, this is exactly the kind of situation American administrations have tried to avoid getting pulled into indefinitely. Sustained military campaigns in the Middle East carry real domestic political costs alongside their strategic ones. And past U.S. administrations have generally preferred short, targeted campaigns aimed at forcing a specific concession over open-ended engagements with no clear endpoint. Whether the current pace, 4 consecutive nights and counting, represents a short, intensive push to force Iran back to the table, or the early stage of something that stretches on for weeks or months, is genuinely still an open question. Nobody covering this story right now, including everything we've walked through today, actually knows the answer yet. That uncertainty is, frankly, the most honest thing you can say about where this stands as of tonight. What we do know, concretely, is this. 4 nights of strikes have hit targets from Bushehr to Abadan to Mashhar. A naval blockade is back in effect on Iranian ports. At least 1 confirmed civilian fatality has resulted from strikes on infrastructure inside Iran, and at least 1 confirmed fatality has resulted from Iran's retaliatory strikes on Gulf shipping. Oil prices have posted their sharpest single-day move in over 6 years. Traffic through one of the most important waterways on the planet has fallen by more than half in a matter of days. And Iran's government is managing all of this while still settling into a leadership transition at the very top, following the killing of its supreme leader back in February. Every one of those facts, taken individually, might read as a single news cycle. Taken together across a single week, they describe a conflict that has moved from a fragile, uneasy ceasefire into what looks, by every measurable indicator we have right now, like an active and escalating war. So here's what I want you watching for over the next several days. Whether Iran responds to the reinstated blockade with further strikes on Gulf shipping and infrastructure, whether any additional regional actors get pulled in, the way Yemen's Houthi rebels already have alongside Saudi Arabia, and whether Trump's threat toward Iranian bridges and power plants actually materializes if Tehran doesn't return to talks. Those 3 signals, more than any single night's headline, will tell you which direction this is actually heading. If this breakdown gave you a clearer, more grounded picture than the scattered headline coverage has, that's exactly why this channel exists. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't, and drop your prediction in the comments for where this stands a week from now. I read every single one, and I'll be pulling directly from this thread for the next breakdown. Thanks for sticking with me through this entire analysis, and I'll see you in the next one.